This video is a very short video trying to describe social pressures and how they influence facts. If we were really doing justice to this subject, we'd have hours of video and shelves of library books on this subject, because there are. And if you want to, you can investigate this further with more reading. Yet the best investigation, as it relates to our class, is to investigate the subject that you're writing about. If your facts were influenced by social pressures, or if the perception of those facts were influenced by social pressures, here's a prime opportunity to write about your subject. All we want to do in this video is try and add to our knowledge, or investigate or analyze social pressures further. Here this slide says, what happens when we want to check our understanding of facts with others? Such as in the statement, did you see that too? If you're with your family, if you're in a class, if you're at your work, don't you have occasion to check with your colleagues to see if they see what you see, if they're as bored as you are, if they're as hungry as you are? Isn't there that desire to confirm with them what it is that you're sensing too? Oftentimes we check for facts with others, and so that can be a time when social pressure can influence whether we decide about facts, what we decide. Or in the second case, what happens when we have a sense of what people commonly or traditionally do, and we say something like, well, everyone has always done it this way, or it's just common sense, when in fact maybe it might not be always that they've done it that way, or maybe that common sense isn't quite as common as we give it credit for. Well, of course, we're not going to investigate this too much, except to say that social pressures are more than just something felt in junior high. There's something that can certainly affect the adult world as well. We use the example of Solomon Asch in our readings, and that helps us understand, I think, some of the examples that you may be writing about. Solomon Asch, briefly, did a very famous experiment that's been repeated and tested time and again about how group perceptions could affect individual judgment. He asked specifically how many were willing to deny the evidence of their senses in favor of groupthink. He set up a group of people who worked for him, of test participants who worked for him, who offered correct and then incorrect answers about a subject. And then he would have an individual who wasn't working for him to see whether they would conform with the rest of the group. In a third of the cases, the individual in that group yielded to the majority in answering and conformed with the group. When acting alone, that individual made mistakes less than 1% of the time. So when individuals used their own senses, they were much more accurate. Later, he talked to the individual test subjects, and they admitted that they did not want to rock the boat by giving the right answer. Now again, we'll talk more about this in class, and you'll have investigated this further in your reading. But social pressures affect people either a third of the time in their lives or a third of the people. Having such a large number can be alarming, of course, because if we're not checking with our own individual sense of what is factual and non-factual, sometimes we're making our decision based on not our own authority, but depending upon others around us, and not through any investigation, but because they say so, which may not be enough. In looking at facts, I talked about these criteria for facts, especially probability and plausibility, which seem to be directly affected by this idea of social pressures influencing our judgment. We sometimes determine what's probable, what's plausible, by what we have in common with other people around us. Does it seem plausible, we ask? Well, based on our experience and our upbringing and the people around us and what they think is plausible, based on what they think is probable, we may or may not decide something's factual. There are historical examples that are rather glaring, and we'll have dealt with those individually in class, but you can probably call them to mind yourself, where other people just said, oh yes, it has to be, oh yes, common sense tells us. And yet, if we take those probability, plausibility, just back up 2 slides, you see how that might affect situation 1 or 2. What is probable? What is plausible? Now, we're not trying to say, we can't trust facts, we can't trust criteria for facts at all. No, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it more complex, really, because it's more accurate to say that social pressures make an understanding of facts more complex. So in summary, There are some potential pitfalls I'd have you think about when dealing with facts and when writing about them for your papers. This certainly shows up in your assignment, but before that it will show up in a quiz and a test. And the idea is we want to have a thorough understanding and not a simplistic understanding of what makes up a fact and what makes up our decisions about facts. In the best student papers, of course, you'll have a really good understanding of how people come to a decision about facts, and they'll think it through. They'll show us how they think. We'll see some examples of that in class, and maybe you're already calling to mind how people are influenced by those social pressures around them. But let's think about these. These might be potential topics that you write about for your paper. First of all, we don't want to confuse facts with non-facts. There are some things that are facts, and sometimes there are other things that people treat as facts, but really not facts at all because they don't conform to the criteria for what makes up a fact. Sometimes people are not taking into account all the relevant facts. They're not looking broadly enough, or history teaches us that facts may not all be in yet. In this case, we have a story that we've read and talked about as a class of the blind man and the elephant, and you might refer back to that parable which teaches us about how sometimes people can have a partial understanding of the facts, or not all the facts when understanding a subject, but still try to reach a conclusion about that set of facts. And then lastly, the Solomon Asch business and the pressures that affect the way that we understand facts. They can determine what we decide about facts as an individual, and really in a much broader way in our society, our environment, and even our powers of observation can affect how we see facts. That's just a brief list. If you're thinking about this, think about your own situation or the topic that you may have chosen for your own paper, and in understanding the facts of the case, analyze what made you come to the decision about what the facts were, and whether that decision was complete, accurate, precise. Writing about the influences to understanding facts can really get you a great paper topic, so you might spend some time considering the complexity with regard to deciding about facts.